Hello everyone, today we talk about city bishops and rural parishes in the early Middle Ages, in early medieval Europe. So this is a topic we partly covered, especially really both of them. We have already analyzed the development of structuration of ecclesiastical administration from late Roman times to early medieval ones. In many ways, if you go into the medieval Christianity playlist, you should be able to find that. There is a video on education, specifically dedicated to education from, let's say, the lower classes to the top ones. Sometimes there is this impression that in early medieval times only, the elite studied something. It's really not the case, especially in certain areas of Europe, specifically speaking. And also we discussed the rise of the preeminence of Rome and the broader, let's say, ecclesiastical organization that starts chiefly from Rome at this period, even though here we're still not. And actually it will remain the case for a long time before the Gregorian reforms, or also this is fairly more complicated, but let's say at least for Western Europe, basically there was not really a center of power in the church like Rome basically would be. Rome was always the closest to that ever existed. It was always the most important ecclesiastical center, both in terms of political, ideological influence and actual, spiritual authority. This was tributed also by the other metropolitic seats, but still there was the idea that these were merely administrative titles. Like, the church needed this hierarchy, but it wasn't, like all bishops were really the same, right? But we will talk about this towards the end of the video. And also I made something about some rural parishes, and especially in actually for a bit as slowly, as likely later time in history, in post-Carolingian times, when there is this proliferation of private foundations of churches and monasteries by the elites. But also this really started since, even not really the early Middle Ages, but actually since the late Roman times. So, but as you understand, and that's why we deal with them together, these topics are deeply intertwined, and they have to do with the broader structuration of ecclesiastical control and management and administration, etc., and the ability of evangelize, of spreading Christianity further in Europe. And what I will try to challenge today is also the idea that the Christianization of Europe was a fundamentally violent event. It actually wasn't, and this is actually widely known. I mean, this is known to anyone who is acquainted with the academic literature on it and on historiography. But still, we need to picture this stuff like a sort of clash of civilizations. Really think that like half of the West we have thrown it away, like it's lost, because people can't distinguish in any form anything different from these two simple dichotomies, like either it was just a positive thing or it was either a negative thing, and everything is about these extremes and nothing exists in the middle. I usually have a different approach towards history in general. First of all, I don't care about ideological sides unless they, I acquaint you with them just right now, right? It's pretty obvious that there can be any theistic or atheistic sympathy that has to interpret history with kind of contemporary judgments, but who really cares? That's not really what historians do for a living. That's just if you want to do that, just go into, I don't know, in politics or follow such events from a non-scientific perspective, because this is really not what we deal with in universities and in our places. And I personally like, however, to give a narrative of I would say of civilization, in the sense that I do believe that throughout. I don't think that this happens teleological throughout all history, but I believe that in general, for this part of history, really, there was a civilization progress of some kind. I mean, there was the recognition that something had to be done about lots of things, including naturally this major crisis that basically made the late antiquity transitioning into something different, and then now we call them the Middle Ages, but actually also these interpretations can be profitably debatable, but it's pretty obvious that, especially in Western Europe, in Latin Germanic Europe, this thing happened pretty clearly, and also in the rest of the Mediterranean and Near East, telling the truth. So it's not really a big deal. The deal, though, is that there's this flattened idea that the early Middle Ages were total darkness, right? And this happens especially for, aside from ignorance that really doesn't lack anywhere, but the concept is that certain countries had kind of, in this sense, darker stories than others. In the sense, dark here is not used for saying that these were dark ages. Erase from your mind the term dark ages if you ever heard it or see it written. Dismiss it, because it's not history. We don't call it like that anymore, and it has nothing to do with political correctness. It's actually that there is nothing dark about the period, aside from the fact that we actually know less. So the only darkness you can spot in there is that we have less sources, but even the relatively few that we have, that are still a freaking lot, because the Middle Ages is massively more documented than actually almost all of the ancient world history. And even in the early Middle Ages, we have a dramatic amount of information compared to what we believed that before was kind of the light, right? This happens naturally for other reasons for which you can't really compare the two civilizations in this base, but just let's say that you should absolutely refuse any sort of flattening of the Middle Ages. I'm sure I know it. People will reason like this. They think the Middle Ages was like just a flat cardiogram until the thresholds of the modern age, and that because the empire had fallen and nothing happened. The Middle Ages, not only they have been basically in a condition of crisis or recession for not more than 1.5 centuries, 2 centuries at worst, but for the rest have been marked by constant, steady, and massive growth for those time standards, and even for previous time standards. But they have substantially achieved to a new synthesis that was unknown effectively in the ancient world, that independently of what certain in fact positions might presume, actually passed through ecclesiastical organization. Not just, this is evident because much of medieval civilization was deeply tied to or however embodied even in part by the ecclesiastical one. So you can't attribute actually to the church anything but first of all a very important role in the development of medieval civilization, but also in the strengthening of an overall positive intention, at least if you really don't want to make the quest for, we all know that the church was corrupted, right? Like every single other political institution that existed at the time. So actually the great criticism that also in part existed at the time is that the church mingled into secular affairs. That was really the big criticism at that point. But also this is fairly, it also depends from which side perspective, but just remember that the church was nothing intrinsically nor better nor worse than what existed out there by default. But from the 11th century starts being a monarchy fundamentally, or like a principality if you want to be like anyone else's. They had their own policies. They were unique in many ways. They definitely had a way to make civilization was impressive, especially for strictly Western standards. Things like bureaucracy and all, it's part that started from Rome, it started from the papacy. It's something that spread eventually into the Angevin system, and eventually, in those areas, and in fact, we're also experiencing more developed political developments, etc. And when it takes, however, we like to look at, in fact, first of all, at the papacy, not considering that the church is something much wider than that. But aside from it, it was effectively from a certain time onwards, especially in Western Europe, all about Rome in many ways, and it starts being the case in early medieval times. But the other important part that I think is deeply overlooked is, in fact, the development of the church through, in fact, as we have said, the development of administration, evangelization, etc., in the early Middle Ages proper, because actually most of what Rome would be later in terms of both of spiritual and temporal power is set in the early Middle Ages, that nobody cares about, because I don't know, maybe that there are, as I said before, these prejudices, because you think that it was all like a flat, like a wasteland and nothing happened. No, any person who has a decent, a non-shameful knowledge of history, that means like the essentials, knows that the early Middle Ages were a moment of great achievements, and especially given the context. Right, you can't judge a civilization if you don't take its context in any form, right? And I'm talking about moral justifications in here, because that it doesn't belong to history. History has literally nothing to do with moral judgment as history. Then, if you want to use history to make moral judgments, you can do it, but not as a historian. When you're a historian, you're just trying to find out what's going on. That is something already dramatically difficult. Right, we leave moral judges to those who know better, because they have guessed it all, and they pretend to be these enlightened, pure souls that from the 21st century can look with contempt at people that were radically more intelligent and capable than them already at the time. And then let's not make relativism about this. We are not more intelligent or more capable than people who lived 1,000 years or 2,000 years ago, right? But aside from this, I think this period is overlooked, because it's a moment in which the church started to do something that objectively not even the Roman Empire had achieved to do. It was to basically starting permeating even those strata of in this case of, let's say, society as a whole, right, wherever the church reached. But in this sense, the church also moves within certain let's say, geographical boundaries that in part overlap the ones of the empire, of course, but that's in fact one of the achievements. The church goes beyond them, right? And it doesn't go there alone. And that's why also the work of a church should be in part, contextualized. First of all, which church? Because as we were saying at the beginning, in early medieval times, there were many autonomous churches, right? Secondly, there were certain political authorities that had pretty heavy influence on them, right? Even within, take Western Europe. Rome was fundamentally still in this kind of area between the Byzantine Empire, the Longobards, and the Carolingians eventually. Northern Italy, for example, had different churches, even within what was, in theory, in control of the Church of Rome from certain point onwards. There were certain bishops that were kind of in competition with Rome. Then you had the Gallic Church, the Merovingian one, let's say, that also was developing with certain proper characteristics on its own. The Anglo-Saxon Church, that also gets influenced by certain aspects. The Roman Church gets through all of them, like in this sense, but this axis that is very, very important, one of that includes even Britain, in fact. This is never to be forgotten. The Iberian Peninsula was developing a bit on its own. That's also interesting, especially, and if it hadn't been for the Islamic invasions, objectively would have developed a very powerful and autonomous church from Rome that the same church kind of feared, because they were developing different liturgies. They were also very strongly inspired by Constantinople, the councils of Toledo. I made a video about those, and eventually, in fact, when the Muslims conquer Spain, what happens is that Rome immediately seizes the opportunity to aid the Christians in the north of the peninsula that are basically besieged by the Muslims, and but asking in exchange to give up the actually the Visigothic liturgy and to adopt the Roman one once again. But the main achievement that is particularly important, that goes beyond the Roman Empire, and that I think at this point shows the depth of level of medieval civilization by certain standards, is the expansion in the countryside. Now, this is particularly in the rural communities. Now, this is very important to understand, in my opinion, and to know in the first place, to be aware of it, because sometimes we think about the Roman Empire as a very pervasive state, like a sort of extremely centralized. It's really not like that. It was basically never like that, especially in the early Roman Empire. It wasn't at all like anything like that. Local governors had kind of a lot of autonomy, and especially Roman rule was really focused, was really based on the cities, first of all, and that's where you get a very sound and solid Romanization proper, because the cities are the seats of the elites, of the great landowners that are deeply involved into this process of redistribution of resources for political commitment within the same cities, and that are relatively uninterested about the countryside that leaves sometimes. I mean, there are not just latifundia out there, but there are certain, in fact, communities of the empire that for centuries remain basically very superficially Romanized, even in provinces that at large were radically and massively Romanized, up to the point that they even started speaking Romance languages, in spite, they weren't italics, they weren't Latins, etc. And Gaul is a beautiful example of that, actually. In fact, but so a great deal actually of Roman presence was based on military deterrence, right? So I'm not saying that Roman Empire didn't have an influence on these regions at all. Surely also the countryside was deeply transformed by the existence of the Roman Empire, but more like a side effect than an actual interest of the Roman rule into the countryside in the rural communities as such. Excuse me, I drink a little bit. Consider that the also Roman cities tend to be not at this time in the early Middle Ages, but let's say Roman cities were less densely populated, for example, than low medieval cities. There were very different economical potentials in here. I'm sure actually that by the 13th century, Europe was a way more developed, wealthier, complex, and expansive system than the Roman Empire could have ever dreamt to be. If anything, it was politically fragmented, but that's another story, and probably that's even part of the reason, however, why it was so successful in many ways. And never think that, don't think that there weren't hierarchies in the Middle Ages, because obviously there were, but also think about the importance, the effects of political centralization and decentralization. That's something that we started, also to address ideologically speaking, but it really depends on the situation in terms of outcomes, etc. And medieval civilization is a pretty good example that things could, go in a pretty interesting direction, at least, even without I would say an ideology that stressed centralization, despite every power at the end of the day tried to centralize in one way or another, even never buy the idea that in the Middle Ages there were no centralized government, because that's pretty silly. I mean, it's obviously, every single society is centralized by a certain degree, right? It only matters on where you want to put the measure, right? And so not even our own societies today are fully centralized. We just go by relative standards, not absolute standards, because by absolute standard, no society can be fully centralized nor devoid of centralization in general. But aside from this, there was, let's say, the creation of a dialogue between the church and the rural communities, right? And the myth that basically the Christianization of Europe passed through slaughters, forced conversions, people butchered down. Well, it's basically a condensation of all this, of all, let's say, it's like picking the Carolingian conquest of Saxony and pretending that that was the standard of Christianization in medieval times. That's actually a pretty childish way to approach at this point, not even history, I believe, because that's just too dumb. But it's it's effective because people need to think that it's all about this intrinsic drama of human societies are, and people in history, as we were saying before, were way more intelligent than people today on average, and this is proved by the fact that in fact we arrived at the point where we were, and we got dumped down by the events essentially. At the time, communities really had dialogue between each other, and there is nothing really progressist into it. I mean, this didn't happen because people were so smart and cool in the sense they had figured everything out. It's simply that the pressure of the situation triggered them into them a reasonable understanding of reality, and trying to cope into this world that was definitely very, very primitive, very, very poor. The early Middle Ages are dramatically poor moments in material culture, etc. They were pretty harsh lives, and that's where you find smarter decisions, right? That's where you find someone who is able to solve actual problems, not invented problems. Because if you have to survive, you don't give a damn about certain aspects of what do you feel like today. You just go out there and do everything you can to survive, and try to build something that works in order to achieve this goal for you and for your family. This process was, especially the progress of Christianization, by the way, was something that, as you understand, in large areas of even the empire, this had occurred by law, right? So that there were groups that were forced to be converted, or that at least had in part accepted this very long moment of transition as something they couldn't really oppose by certain standards. The idea that the late Roman times were a set of butcheries due to religious clashes is also absurd. All religious clashes of all sort are always, and I mean always, mixed with way many and like overwhelmingly prevalent other reasons, basically, that you can't reconduct a religion. But there is, I don't care here how try and hard I will try to explain this, there is always be someone who will say, okay, no, it was all about that, and either from one side or one other. That's why I'm accused of being either one thing or the other, because simply people have no orientation anymore in terms of values, of morality, orientation. Just study history, please, and see real history, not the one you imagine in your mind, flashing, shooting movies and dramatizing things because it makes you feel well. Studying history means that you have to literally spit blood in order to understand something. And most of the people, actually all the people who do like that, actually do not know what history really is. And that's how their language also develops, like, putting everything into relativism, because all that matters is how they decide to feel, right? Unfortunately, nobody cares about how they feel. Maybe their families or friends, but reality is a bit tougher than that, and frankly doesn't give a damn about you or about anybody else. So the process of Christianization was largely pacific, and also another point that has always to be remembered in this sense is that it was largely consensual. Why? Well, simply because there is no default incompatibility between faith and right. And this is also an essential macroscopical datum of history of religions, when it takes into account theisms, what we call polytheism or paganism or whatever, is that that also is probably misunderstood, is that monotheistic faith is something substantially different as a mechanism, on a very different level from what we call polytheism, right? First of all, think that polytheism doesn't exist as such. The term polytheism is a monotheistic invention. It has nothing to do with how really what we call as polytheists or pagans, including animists, etc., really thought like. And there is extensive evidence from all times. Basically, the concept of faith was on a completely different level from the concept of this kind of social contract that polytheistic rituality entailed. I even made a video about this, just search for the syncretism of the North, Schwerpunkt on YouTube. You can, that's a pretty good evidence actually of a Viking who converted himself alone to Christianity, actually, because it was disaffection from right, because it didn't quite work according to him, and there is a massive coexistence, especially in this Germanic North, that everybody today has to project as a sort of ultra-reactionary thing that was opposed to the terrible Christians that came with swords in hand to evangelize these poor people just because they were, fanatics with a book in their hand. That's not factual history. That's not factual history, and that's where here the guy comes. Oh well, but the Carolingians with Saxony. The Carolingians freaking invaded Saxony. Alright? And the reason why they do it, it's not because they were pagans. The reason they do it is because the Saxons were actually real jerks, as much as the Carolingians could be. We had been harassing literally for centuries the whole Austrasian area, like murdering, killing, slaughtering, as it was the norm by the time. The Carolingians needed to secure the Eastern Front. The side of their empire, they decided to reach the Elbe River, even with the aid of the Slavs, who, by the way, were pagans and were enemies of the Saxons, and eventually became enemies of the Carolingians when the Saxons were wiped out and Saxony englobed. So what was the deal with the forced conversions of the Saxons? Well, we can't make a video about this. I will do it one day, but first, the only sources we have are Carolingians, and those are the same ones who say about the slaughter of Verden, etc. That's Carolingian propaganda about themselves. The Carolingians loved the fact that they were the people of God. The Carolingians thought that they were the second Jews of the situation. They loved the Old Testament. Charlemagne was dreadfully passionate about it. That perfectly fitted with their idea of God helping the Frankish warriors and fighting alongside with them, right? And that was a model that they never abandoned, and they had to show that with those biblical models that are extremely violent, and telling the stories, the wars which the Jews got in, etc., that were basically repeating that. And as far as we know, that story of I don't know how many thousand Saxons were beheaded there because they refused, to accept Christian faith, formally, by the way, is what the hell do you think we know about it for real? Like, do you think that you can read a chronicle from the 9th century and pretend that that's really, telling you what has happened for real, right? I'm sure there were many Saxons who were beheaded, for not talking about all the ones that were massacred by the Carolingians during their wars, but probably what happened on that day, simply there was some punitive strike of some of the chieftains that didn't want to surrender, and they were literally beheaded. But it wasn't the bath of blood that probably you think, even though for those same the same moral standards of the time, that was a kind of an exceptional thing. Because believe it or not, even in early medieval times, there are ways in order to kill people that are, acceptable, and others that are kind of not. And gratuitous violence actually is never, advocated, it's never defended as such. And the Carolingians were the ones here who really wanted to give the powerful message of saying, look at what we have done, because we are the strongest one in the name of God, and achieving this result for our valor, fundamentally, as warriors, as and not just as Christian warriors, because at this time, do you think the Carolingians had a clear idea of what Christianity really was? I mean, the Carolingian clergy didn't even know how to read Latin. Took a reform of the whole freaking imperial clergy in order to achieve that by certain acceptable degrees. Secondly, what was the attachment of the Saxon to their policy? Right, it was full of pagans out there. As soon as they watched what the Carolingian nobles said, okay, let's convert to Christianity because that's effective, and that's how we can strengthen our authority, our strength as a centralized, monarchy. Let's say a centralized monarchy. Let's say in order to emerge from this, more or less egalitarian nobility that doesn't want to know anything about kings. You can see all the dark sides of that story as well. I'm not saying that centralization goes without a price, but hey, that's where kind of modernity stemmed from, right? That's what Louis XIV, 17th century France is about. That's where modernity comes from. It's the state starts. It starts in here. And through models that were being pioneered, in fact, partly by this more politically developed entities, but also from the church, in fact, that from which the Carolingians drew heavily, because they didn't have a freaking anything that even remotely resembled to a state. The Frankish world was totally privatized. Starting from the monarchy, there was a private thing, right? The Carolingians had, as all the Franks, didn't have the minimal understanding of what public authority is. They had to go to conquer a kingdom like the one of the Longobards, and getting in touch and in intense relations with the church in order to figure how things worked. But by certain standards, they started something about it, and that is to be regarded as something. But mostly it started from the church, from within the same Carolingian Empire in the first place. So the Saxons, as such, had tribal society, where practically the tribal element is all about it. You have rights that regulate religiously political life. So if you think that was a world, for example, where religion wasn't kind of pervasive, mentally speaking, it was just about being cool and going around smashing things because you think you are free, and that's completely out of the discussion. Societies like the pagans were all basically about the idea that nobody had to stand up like a chieftain, someone that could take over, which is even something you can relate to. Like, you can say, well, it's fine, but it passed through religion in part. That is the sacerdotal class, or what which is also a very categorical way to put it, but the word stuff like that as well was basically controlling step by step what every single freeman was doing in order to assure that they wouldn't create something that could overstep the power of the collectivity, right? And I give you that it's not bad. I mean, it's the idea what also part of our democracy is really about, but it's based on a social compromise. It's not based, in fact, on the idea that the Saxons were happy, because they thought they were pure and free. They were killing each other, raiding into Frankish territory, doing the worst imaginable things just for aggrandizing their power. They had aristocracies that controlled the business. Every pre-industrial society was mafia-like, by definition. Before the building of a centralized state, mafia in the truest sense of the word, it was not like mafia. It was exactly mafia in every aspect of it, in every single damn aspect of it. That was still, at the time, for the technological potential of the time, for how society worked, it was the only way you could have a society in the first place. So it wasn't even all bad in it for those time standards, right? So I need to be radical in here, because if people don't get this simple concept, you can't even pass a basic medieval history exam at the first year of university. And this is not my opinion. I deliver you what is taught worldwide in every academy that people loathe and despise and think it's all about, I don't know, leftism nowadays. No, it's not. It's actually full of very intelligent people, and this is like the ABC of how the world had worked at the time. And it's pretty homogeneous in here. Here it's not a matter of your little tiny flag. I like these guys here, those other guys here are evil. No, it doesn't work like that. It does not work like that. History is not to support your imaginary friends from the past. It doesn't work like that. It's not like that. If you really reason like that, you're just delusional. And you have serious psychological problems, partly because you're an ignorant, and that's how it works. Then if you accept it, better for you. Otherwise, do not talk about history if you don't know it. So don't whine because your imaginary friends get butchered down. They would have not liked to be your friends. They would have most likely thought that you were a pile of rubbish at best, if had seen you what you were today. Just because you descend from someone vaguely in the area, this doesn't mean that your ancestors would be proud of you. They would spit on you for what you have become. In general, only for the way we live today. So do not think these are your friends, because they are not. And partly they wouldn't even be right, because, who the hell cares? So I need these rants, because I meet this, I don't even know how to say it. It's like a mold. Like you can't, it's like speaking to a wall, right? If you don't really predispose yourself to accept these ideas, you can't know history. What we know history is, which means proper research on the base of evidence, not, the story of the guy that tells you that something happened in the past. Those are movies. That's entertaining. History is a serious thing, right? And always reflect that every time I tell you this story, I always tell you the bright sides and the dark sides, all the time. I said this now about the Carolingians, I said this now about the Saxons, because that's how we know it. At least we today have kind of figured out partially how it was. There are no other interpretations. All the rest is fantasy, and it's not scientific by academic standard. And I'm trying to tell these stories also with a certain language, because it's maybe easier to understand. But there is actually a very serious literature on these topics that actually explains you how it was. Want to read the stories, just study, there is a Polish historian, very extremely famous in mediavistics all over worldwide, wrote a book, is the Barbarian Europe, the Europe of the Barbarians, by Modzelewski. Read him. And shut up about your imaginary friends. Study history. Be an adult, don't be a child. So what I was saying, basically that the right implied a social contract. So it wasn't absolutely incompatible with fate. So why did the Saxons resist so much? Because they had foreigners invading their homes. For goodness sake, how do you think it works, history? That the Carolingians invaded Saxony because they were a bunch of Christian, bloodthirsty maniacs who wanted to convert everybody they saw. How do you think things are justified, historically speaking? Because either you actually believe what is the historiography of the time that is exclusively propaganda, because there is nothing like free thinking before, very late in time in our civilization. Do you think you're basically falling, in fact, to a very clever 8th century propaganda, but you live in the 21st century, you should have known how these things are. So the Saxons were presumably fighting even for their beliefs, because they wanted their tribe to remain the way it had always been. They wanted their laws to remain the way they always were. They wanted to maintain their autonomy, their freedom. They probably attached to their religious, to their holy places and to their beliefs this validity and and meaning about how society should be. You have someone that invades your territory, you fight for it. It's not, let's say, religion in this sense is all one with how the mechanism works, but it's not purely religion, but not even by larger part religion. It's societies are not simple as that. There are classes, groups, whatever you want to call them, that have certain interests and work for them. There was definitely a local Germanic aristocracies who accepted what was going on because they saw that would make them fit. Well, look up the Steininger revolt. That was literal, this Germanic elites of Eastern Francia now intermarried with the Carolingian counts that were trying to knock out the middle classes of freemen, so to make them impoverished and lose power, like in a sort of transforming them in the half free. Remember that this, by the way, were societies that had slaves. So it's not that they were the best, exactly the best pure model of virtue of freedom. Of course, you can say, well, that's contextual. Well, thanks. Yes, finally you got it. So let's simply tell the story without thinking that everything is an accusation. Because that means to be paranoid, and there are drugs for curing them. There are therapies to cure anxiety and delusions and obsessions and paranoias. So take that into consideration. Leave history alone. Leave history alone. So getting finally to the point, actually, well, I had to hand, this basically, throughout all the northern world, Christianity penetrated and was accepted by large parts of the populations, even before then any political actor said, okay, well, I will impose you this with force. And you know what? That even in the Christian world, as it had been formed into the Romano-Germanic kingdoms, there was no witch hunting. Like, aside from the fact that literal witch hunting is something that mostly pertains to modern Protestant countries rather than to Catholic Middle Ages, to be honest. People were burned at the stake, but actually the greatest witch hunting, the most intense, were exactly into the modern age and in Protestant countries, where in Rome people, laughed at the idea of burning a woman as a witch on the stake, just for reminding some stories, by the way. But even in there, what's the point of converting? What do you think that there was this enormous effort to create a church? Do you think it was an ideological thing? That it was like, the evil guys, say, haha, now we will start the church to oppress everyone, to make them pay tithes, etc. Of course, they were squeezing people, just like any other single political entity at the time was doing. As long as the people were there to take that, in the sense that were also, it was a continuous social struggle, political struggle between the communities and so on. It's not that at this time even kings or popes could kid with the rest of the whole world. So what you're left with is actually with some form of consensual organization. And frankly, what concerned even the Christianization of the countryside, it was superficial, really. During the early Middle Ages, formally, all these regions became Christian by the 11th century. At least in Western Europe, most of it was Christian by name and by form, evidently. But do you really think that people were Christian? Like they actually believed, they actually understood? How do you think a medieval peasant could understand something like theology? Honestly, how do you think these things were actually exclusive of other beliefs, by the way, especially in communities like the rural ones, where there were beliefs and cults and rites and a lifestyle that had gone on that way for millennia. How do you think like that one guy coming with a book could change their mind? We have no knowledge of persecution of the peasantry in here, that these guys were terrible pagans, and they were butchered down by the local counts and bishops combined. right? That maybe happened in Saxony because the priests were actually spies to look where there was some allegiance to the old regime of that could easily, at least could theoretically overthrow Carolingian rule still, because majority of the people obviously were not happy of the Franks having come to rule on their land. But that's pretty much it. When you take Western Europe, the Christianization was something extremely peaceful. As far as and it was largely led by real missionaries that went even in foreign lands, therefore where there was basically no way to there was no supportive government in there to say, now we impose everything. And they were obviously presenting an offer, a model of political, social, and organization more than just a belief. How do you think Christianity spread? I mean, do you really think it was at the point of the sword? That everybody that became Christian at that point was because there was someone pointing the sword at their neck? Are you really so naive to believe something like that? So from the 5th century onwards, let's put it like this, there was from the cities this the start of a work of Christianization. This is important to understand. The thing started from the cities. These had become, after the collapse of the western half of the Roman Empire, the real center of organization. Western Europe had been solidly urbanized by the Romans, and that's how the system had worked forever. Like Northern Europe, Central Europe, Eastern Europe, very few cities actually known, depending, just even on the area. There were certain areas of Northern Europe and Central Europe where the Romans had founded cities, etc. But also that's also when they incidentally declined the most, simply because there were not enough local resources to maintain such complex systems after the empire as a broader net had collapsed. In fact, those had been prevalently militarized centers. But the concept is that after the collapse of the empire, something remains. The empire doesn't collapse in the sense that it crumbles. It is torn. It's basically torn apart violently. It's literally destroyed and razed to the ground. That didn't happen concretely. I mean, there were certain areas that were raided and pillaged, but that was kind of half because of the same Romans that killed each other, large part, in part also by these populations, especially those who were actually passing to eventually to go away. But normally the Germans that arrived in places where they wanted to settle obviously didn't destroy anything. I mean, are you stupid to destroy something where you're gonna live that actually works? And say, oh well, but the aqueducts and all that stuff, I have no knowledge of aqueducts that were destroyed because, these were kind of hubris filled Germanic drunk nerds who came there just to raise aqueducts to the ground. You take the Roman aqueducts of Rome during the siege of Rome of the Ostrogoths. Well, yeah, they cut down the aqueduct because they had to take the freaking city. How do you think it's the Romans? The Romans did the same exact things. Byzantines razed entire cities to the ground just not to make scorched land strategy, right? That's normal, and that's incidentally, and that's why people are obsessed. They have to think it's cultural. Those were the evil guys. Those were wicked guys. If you had only studied something about military history, damn it, you would know that that's the absolutely homogeneous practice of warfare of the time in every single kind of people existed ever. Point. Go beyond this garbage, please. Everything restarts from the cities. It's obvious. Those had been the main points of connection of the empire. That's where the largest part of the wealth had gravitated for a long time. They're fortified centers. They're well connected. the road system is crumbling, but it's not the disaster we think. People also travel much less. There are much less traffics. It's normal that you don't invest anymore in things like aqueducts for make 100,000 people drink if you have only 5,000 now people who can drink simply along a river. So that's how, and this happened in centuries. Like it didn't change from a day to another. It's very progressive one. Why does Christianization starts from the cities? Well, this is also pretty clear. There is this particular urban aristocracy over which the Roman social organization during the empire had rested as a system that that having grown, let's say, from the exercise of arms and actual labor, lived simply on their rent. Had lived at least simply of their rent, because now there's also a process of remilitarization of the aristocracies that in Roman times instead had just simply dedicated itself to politics, right, within the city, as we said before, and to philosophical speculation, etc., right? And the system worked. You can't really think about the Roman otium as people being lazy, sitting there thinking about philosophy while the empire collapsed. That's also stupid, pretty stupid. As it's stupid actually to think that the empire crumbled because the aristocracies gave up. That's also pretty ideal. If the system is, if there is war because you're invaded, and the system doesn't work because reinvesting in the cities that are usually targeted by raiders and sieges, etc., and they're crumbling. It's not convenient anymore. Why shouldn't you reinvest, for example, in other forms of wealth? That's why, for example, there is this coming back to the land in the late Roman times, in early Middle Ages. Made lots of videos about this topic. So the point here is that this original say social stratum had been progressively Christianized in Roman times, because this was the elite. And the elite is not stupid, is clever, is able to take actually most of the, first of all, understanding what's going on, because they're the ones who are literally in charge. So they know how to how the mechanisms of power work. They are within a Christian empire now, and this empire is doing pretty well, by the way, because I challenge you to think that, like in the 4th century and the 6th century, whether people thought that the empire was in crisis, because it wasn't, at least, well, let's say in the first half of the respective empires. So also this perspective of decadence, etc. It's not really something that things started going differently from a day to another. Didn't take literally centuries, and when you have literally centuries of transformation before something actually changes, in even decreasing or having kind of a sensible shrinking, you say that, well, maybe that's not really a general crisis, that's just a natural tendency of certain societies to evolve in a certain direction. And this myth that societies has always to grow, this is something that we came up, it's a delusion we came from, like 200 years ago. Before, nobody would have ever even thought of that. It was normal. Actually, it was believed that the world was a continuous in continuous decadence by certain standards. This is not just a Christian view, it was something that belonged to many other beliefs. And the elites get Christianized. It is true that it begins before through the masses, because also these masses of disinherited people that thought that now the Christian message gave them a hope, gave them an answer of some sort, that I'll say was talking at a deep level to that type of society, for many reasons. It wasn't all you can't see an improvement overall, because actually you see that society gets stratified, so things are not happy. And that's also partly why Christianity has this broader embracing message. Everybody can join. It's not like Mithraism that is very exclusive. It's all about, you think about mostly about the military. It's also pretty violent. Christianity has inherently kind of a positive message, and just a twisted interpretation of Christianity can say, oh well, this is just meant to oppress people. Because you can oppress people literally with every single kind of ideology. You can easily oppress people with Buddhism. Buddhism is actually freaking dangerous. Buddhism is basically accepted. Humans should be devoid of emotions. That's what a psychopath is. This has been exploited also historically speaking to train, fundamentalist groups to effectively kill people in the end. Because if you deny humanity, that's what happens. Christianity is an aim to humanity. You have God that takes human form, for goodness sake. How can this be a negative message? Whichever it is. This has nothing to do with whether you believe or you do not believe. And this has nothing to do how thoughts are applied. Do you think that Christianity as any other utopia has ever been applied or interpreted in the univocal way? Do you think there is one Christianity? That's crazy. That's crazy. What happens is that progressively the Roman senatorial elites turn into Christian elites, partly senatorial as well, still those are within the empire. Those who are outside the empire now, they change somewhat. Here it's interesting because the church effectively never abandoned the idea that it was within a Roman empire. Even though we shouldn't perhaps stress that much this allegiance to imperial institutions, because actually the church, as soon as they could, as any other social group, that they tried to acquire autonomy on their own, like the clergy in general did this, and that's what the papacy stems from at the end of the day. But they definitely were within that universalistic message and within the idea that they were the continuators of something greater. And this is evident especially in the West, where, as we've said a lot of times actually, the world, as the concept of empire never came apart. Other very important interpretation. Do not think that in Western Empire, first of all, the day the empire fell in Western Roman Empire, it happened absolutely nothing. Nothing. And majority of people of the time had absolutely no idea that this thing had ever happened, even. It's just a symbol. You can't take so many events that had a much more massive impact. And what, by the way, average people really thought, we don't really know about at the time. But there is no evidence to say that anything concrete changed at that point. And the idea of the empire is not, as I always say, it's not a Victorian empire. The universal empire has no borders. It's a place that basically, covers the whole freaking earth. So there is a mystics behind this that naturally the church had embraced it since the beginning. In the Christian message that is absolutely totalizing into this, and that creates actually a pretty sharp distinction between spirituality and and secular affairs, right? Which doesn't mean divorce. It simply means that what belongs to the church belongs to the church, and the rest, it's not that it doesn't exist, but it kind of doesn't matter. And this is an hyperbole, basically to say that the spiritual side should be so important that all the rest exists, but it comes to be subordinate. And that's obviously a utopia, but that's also what actually shows you that there are multiple levels of thinking. That's not like the pagan world, where basically, if you don't make that right, not only the divinity gets angry at you, but at your whole freaking community, and therefore you have to be, killed, crucified, because they think that that's what messes up. If an illness arrives or a famine arrives, an earthquake happens, etc. That's paganism in a nutshell, by the way. So the transition from late to the late Roman to early medieval times are naturally extremely slow and degenerate as syncretism in the cult, right? And that's what we were telling before. How do you think that really Christianity spread? That one day everything was imposed. One day a guy living in the Roman Empire woke up, and so legionnaires telling him, knocking at the door and obliging him to get baptized, kneeling in front of the authority. How do you think that actually happened? That took a good millennium to happen. Let's discard this idea that there was even if you take the pagan persecution and the Christian persecutions, that did happen. There were something very local and tied to political, economical, and social problems that were in the name of religion, but what wasn't in the name of religion in the pagan world or in the Christian world. It's literally all about religion, and this doesn't mean that it's actually triggered or explained or motivated solely or even by the major part by religion. It's the same thing that I said about the Crusades. Obviously these things were about religion, but the main motives were, they were enormous. There is a enormous vast historiography about this that simply tells you that we cannot know. That the whole thing is so complicated, we know so few at the end of the day, that it doesn't even make sense to pose the question. But everything seemed to know better. Like, everybody knows exactly what happened at this time. Right? Because they were there and they know everything. Alright? And even if they were there, being there, historically speaking, doesn't mean at all understanding what happens. Just saying, by the way. So the main change that it's best documented, let's say, and it's for obvious reasons, is the one that happens within the cities, because basically the functioning of urban magistracies basically transitioned in great part into the hands of the church. Now, this sounds as if these two entities, like the state and the church, were two radically different things. Actually, they were the same exact people. Like I was saying before, we talk about the senatorial elite, but that's basically what became the episcopal elite. And always remember that at this time bishops are just, they can't get married, they can do anything. It's normal by Christian standards, okay? It was already seen by certain currents, like saying, oh well, but you shouldn't get married because you shouldn't be too focused about, the pleasures of the flesh and all this stuff, but they could. There was nobody that said that they actually couldn't, right? So it's dramatically easy to transition in this phase without any conflictuality. There is a continuity of interests, of powers, and the public powers within the cities get into into episcopal hands that easily, right? So if you take a larger look at the story, you find that the expansion of this system happens, in fact, at the same level, actually within the same tracks of what the Roman imperial administrations had been. From the 5th century, you see, for example, that the evangelization of the countryside starts from the foundation of baptismal churches. The parishes, basically speaking, that are directly controlled by the urban clergy and by the bishopric. And when you look at the expansion of these foundations, well, that happened into the field of the dioceses. So that is the territory that is put under the authority of each bishop, that corresponded roughly but consistently to the territory was traditionally subjected to the city in the administrative organization of imperial times. The dioceses were created seemingly under Diocletian as a normal the structuration of the empire. They didn't have a religious, an ecclesiastical meaning. I mean, it turns out that the clergy, the church, simply organized itself within the same districts. There were obviously logic because there were still at base. There was the city, and this was the most obvious, logistical and sensible choice you could do. I mean, the Romans were quite pragmatic about this. I mean, and as everybody else, arguably, what is that wrong in given that the dioceses are created within the cities, that the cities are the most Christianized communities, and that the cities already govern, administratively speaking, into the countryside, in the surrounding district. Why shouldn't it follow these patterns, even in terms of ecclesiastical organization? That's how it happened. And this is important for two reasons. First of all, because we have seen, and now we will see it better. I mean, the actual evangelization of the countryside, that is a direction into which the Roman secular authorities had never take a huge interest into, simply because there was no Christian, simply there was no religion to, in this sense, impose but this is also a wrong concept, because we will see now that basically the church also didn't give a damn. In fact, if the local the country communities didn't actually believe, I mean, there were sects of paganism that maintained themselves up to, we can argue not today, but let's say with massive transformations for the most obvious reasons of living in a Christian continent, up to very late in time. We're talking about the modern age, even the contemporary age, depending on where. Naturally, in Western Europe this was much rarer, because society was way more interconnected, and it didn't leave much room in this sense. But there is this other aspect that is important, is that the episcopal authority is also, and probably especially in this context, the actor that configurates itself as a medium between the preservation of the territorial organization of late antique legacy. Now, what does this mean? It means basically that there is no that these were basically the only authorities there that had remained. Like, the state had vaporized, right? These new Germanic conquerors had come, and naturally they had created their own political system that in many ways did resemble, especially in southwestern Europe, what Roman rule had been. I mean, there is a very intense Romanization by many standards. But really the key figures in the process that also helped dramatically the Romano-Germanic kingdoms to be established are the bishops, is the elites. The elites that intermarry with the Germanic elites, they form this very solid and solidly mixed element. At the beginning, everything is naturally more complicated than it seems, meaning that think about Arianism and think of what the Germanic conquerors had in mind, originally speaking, also in terms of the creation of a proper state, let's say, or something that resembled it at least. And that's when I talk about civilization that is dramatic. Go look, please, those videos I made about Clovis that explains this all and what it meant, even for the Germans to transform themselves and to accept the fact they had to get in these territories that were overwhelmingly populated than their meager demic strength could ever support in order to rule with iron fist. What happens is that they most obviously can rule this territory exclusively because of the senatorial, episcopal class. That's how the Carolingian Empire is born in the first place. But even the Merovingian one at the end of the day, the Carolingian dynasty specifically, if you look at their genealogy, but where they descended from, but that's really how the process had to be settled, right? And there were certain Roman-Germanic kingdoms that understood this quickly, like Clovis. I made the example before because he was like the smartest guy around. He perfectly understood what he was doing. He was like the Constantine of the situation from the Roman side. He perfectly understood how things were, and he created the most solid power ever seen in a Germanic context. The others had trouble because Arianism was opposed to Catholicism. It was like fundamentally this declaration of, it wasn't really about religious issues here. Even when you think this struggle between Arians and Catholics, you don't have to think about actual persecutions. There were contexts in which this went long for a lot of time that didn't actually bring to persecutions. In this sense, you don't have to buy literally, like papal historiography of the time, because those are telling basically the Germans, the Arians, let's say, that were against them, were, constantly accused. Like the popes hated the Vandals' guts at all, but they had very different attitude, for example, towards the Ostrogoths. And the most obvious reason is that they had different interests that have nothing to do with religion. The Vandals and the Goths were both Arians. This wasn't the problem, really. But there was a bigger picture that has to do with essentially with how Arianism is basically a declaration of Germanism that in turn is a declaration of wanting to be partner of the empire, because otherwise they would have remained pagan and not converted to Arianism, but still not wanting to be assimilated by the empire. That's very important, because that's how the Germanic elites converted to be accepted by the Christian empire as legitimate interlocutors, and finding a gap within the same empire, not destroying it. A place in the empire to dwell. So all this process entails that the bishops, that are also dramatically educated people, because they're the same Romanized senators that live into these areas of Western Europe, are the ones who know how to administrate a sedentary reality. The Germans were kind of semi-nomadic. They didn't know how to manage a city. The bishops did, and that's why necessarily they needed to control the relations with this class, because otherwise was gonna help you to create an administration if you are barely literate at this point. You need these resources, and you need a broader connection at this point, also because the Church of Rome especially has certain attritions with Constantinople since the beginnings, telling the truth, because these are two different countries, let's be honest, and being part of the empire doesn't mean exactly to share everything that a narrower part of what the empire had been actually wants to enforce onto another one, because of its interests that are. So the Roman Church is also kind of friendly to naturally to the process of Christianization that these Romano-Germanic kingdoms autonomously underwent, for the reasons that we explained about, because the system would have not been sustainable in the first place in a different way. And secondly, because they realized that they can't keep controlling these guys if they accept Roman spiritual authority, and the majority of the Romano-Germanic kingdoms actually do it, because also they understand that it's a pretty good mean of let's say a pretty useful contact, an indirect contact, let's say, with Constantinople, but at the same time that legitimates them in part under, especially on the grounds of Christianity, that at this point seems to be the most important thing. And this has a lot to do also probably with how the Germans saw the same process of Christianization, meaning that they didn't abandon immediately their view of the world, their ethos, etc. So actually they believed that by adopting the Roman God, that is the Christian God at this point, because remember that Christianity now is one thing with the empire, what happens is that they should theoretically get part of the same divine benevolence that is also the one that allows the empire to exist in the first place. And this actually is a very strongly pagan-oriented perception of what the empire proper is, that the Byzantines are now articulating on a much more solid legalistic base and juridical base that is, however, partly not really denying the origins of the empire, but kind of having forgotten them. And this is a kind of a paradox, because probably not even the Germans realized this, but let's say that the original concept of the empire was much closer, in fact, to this pagan tribal mentality for how it had been developed in archaic Rome than what it was the legalistic Byzantine ideal at that point. It was perfectly legitimate. Given that, I'm a great supporter actually of at least of the legitimacy of that interpretation that is also born out of civilization, because the Roman Empire, the Roman law, etc., wasn't born in a day. It was a process of the creation of the most important empire of Western antiquity. So it's part of that, but at the same time, these are simply two different ways of looking at the world that have some meeting points and some logics that are kind of valid from each other's perspective and interests, and because this also has to do with what the elites probably elaborate. Unfortunately, we know very few about it. We would all like to know what was in Clovis' head, thinking at converting to Christianity or receiving the imperial vicary of the Gauls by the Eastern Roman, by the Byzantine Emperor. But we don't, and however, it's, in my opinion, this is a great field of interpretation and that has to be revived at a certain point, because we all know it's risky from an ideological point of view, because it sounds very kind of Indo-Aryan in the essentials, and these are interpretations now that they are not very fashionable. Let's say we are still in the wake of a great attention more to kind of the multicultural element in the late antiquity, in this strictly cultural sense, like the idea that this was a great container, which really was, telling the truth, because that's what the empire was, and that's how the same Germans in the first place were allowed in, and that's how the empire had been born in the first place and prospered, right? Now, I know that many of you have certain interpretations, maybe that they do not fit, or maybe relatively to this last one would come up with some other consequences, but now we are not interested into this now. What I'm trying to say, I guess, is that there is a huge convergence of interests and between the Germanic elites and the episcopal elites, which entail the evangelization and a cultural dialogue. Like, how do you just imagine to be a bishop of a Gallic city in the 5th century, and you have to deal at the late 5th century. You have to deal with the Frankish invasion. How do you relate yourself with these with these people now. Their chieftains, their beliefs, their different view of the world. I mean, it's a deep view of the world. It's a bit deep difference, right? Probably not so radical as we're used to think. It's not that these peoples at the time in Europe were so different after all. But there is all the problem of models of educations, of ethics, but there is a hybrid. So it's not just that the Germans get kind of civilized in the process, but it also gives something, right? And that's important, because much of what we see in the Middle Ages, and even in the Ancien Regime up to the 20th century, basically has to do with these roots that in turn partly existed also within the Roman perspective since the origin. So when we look at this process of evangelization, this great work of evangelization, we can interpret it as a great process of acculturation from an anthropological point of view, that is, of reciprocal exchange between different cultures. This process, as we just said, didn't work just in one direction. And when we look at the countryside, we see that the traditional cults of the country that were largely pagans, of course, did work on, for example, on the Christian doctrinal definition, determining, for example, the affirmation of certain aspects of Christian, religiosity, if we can say, that were fairly close to popular sensibility. For example, the cult of the saints and of the relics. Now, this is so important. Now, we it's a pity we don't talk about Byzantine history from a while now, but talking about iconoclasm, these are extremely important years, and this process is fundamental as well. But in the West, that is what more narrowly we're focusing on today. That is also important, and if you really want the sources for this, just read Christian Hagiography of the time. Christian Hagiography of the time is fantastic. Naturally, much of what happened at that time proper is something we know from sources that are much later. But they're so meaningful because they were at the same time part of these local traditions, and what you see is that there is a sort of solid syncretism. Even, for example, I don't know, in pagan world, there were lots of animals that were kind of considered, part of a manifestation of deity, etc. We all know how Christianization happened in these places. It was basically overlapping the Christian beliefs and identity onto the pre-existing one, the pagan ones, so that if you look at these hagiographies, you find always the monk that arrives in a place where there is nothing, and there is an animal like a stag or something, even bear, that basically helps to live, and he tames them, and this is naturally a symbol of God, of nature, that has sent him to feed. And there is also this materially poor world in which the monk has to work and to struggle, and God makes miracles. This all reflects the dreadful material poverty of the time, where the local communities saw into the monastic activity that was, by the way, very different in part from the episcopal structuration, but as a model of civilization. The monk, after all, these first monasteries were simply places where people went to live, to survive. Let's be honest about this. How do you think these are not the monasteries where there are big, massive walls of, like, you start finding in the from the 10th, the 11th centuries. These are, I mean, even before, of course, but in general, these are, especially in the very first centuries of the Middle Ages, like the 6th century, 7th. These are just shelters, and they were usually somehow in contact with local community, which is obvious. Maybe detached. Just think about also how Europe at the time could be, really, just naturalistically speaking. All these places that are, even communications are more difficult. So the monks, according to hagiography, come to redefine the landscape by coming into these places and transforming them and making, God makes springs arising from play. And this is what you realize at the end of the day. This is all this is, let's say, the local communities appreciate this because the monks start, for example, to not just to make miracles, but for example to work the land. They start building their hut. There is also this material dimension you can find even in Benedictine rule, where the monks have to work, not just to pray. And that's obvious because if you don't work, you can't eat, and you can kind of rely on miracles for a while, but something tells me that maybe you need to fill your stomach consistently if you want to survive. So it's a model of survival. It's a way of living in the world, and it's interesting now to see how, in fact, the most famous saints and relics, etc., are often associated to figures that are not detached from, like, especially in the West, that have to do much with more with local history. Like in the East, for example, you find these great fathers of the church that are these hieratic figures that have this, even more kind of honorific. The Eastern Church is also much earlier. There are more cities. It's a wealthier area. The regions get Christianized much earlier than Europe. So it's, at least in continental Europe, and so it's a bit of a different world in which these figures are more like abstractions in some ways, or at least maybe abstraction is not the right word, but at least they're great figures that go beyond the local level by certain standards. Also, this largely depends actually on how the church eventually redefined these figures from the origins of Christianity, of monasticism, etc. In the West, it's much more different. It's as if these saints, as it happened, by the way, came to substitute the local deities. Many saints are actually also invented because they never quite existed, but this happens not just also to substitute the pagan deities, but simply to maybe create some edifying stories, but in the West it's particularly important because you realize that many saints and cults, etc., are actually not created with Christianization. They pre-existed, and simply Christianization reclothed them in a fitting way, and even building shrines, etc., over certain places of cult, right? And making this, reinterpretation of the story. And the myth that this happened with some kind of violence, because let's assume Saint Boniface that cut down the tree of the Frisians and that they butchered him down. Well, that was kind of, I'm not saying it's fair, but it kind of closer to that, because obviously the pagans had a different morality and the Christians too, so that was a problem, was dramatic, but those are the excesses of martyrdom. But it's not that we are aware of excessive, of constant, of local communities but rejecting this monks, like saying they simply saw them like people who had come there to make a living, and progressively introducing them to this stuff. And this was not really confrontational most of the times, but cooperational, and things got progressively substituted in that sense. And I'm sure there was some form of occultation, or at least of certain pagan beliefs were eliminated or re-narrated, but overall, within the same Christian hagiography, there is a lot of that spiritual legacy that doesn't quite disappear. In terms of symbolisms, and especially this approach with nature, animals are particularly important, and places proper. That's where the accent is oppose, in fact, and they lived on within Christianity, and that's what really the cool thing is, that imagining that Christianization happened as a sort of exclusion of the pagans, for which, doesn't quite make sense. First of all, the Christians really didn't have the strengths nor the interest to convert the countryside radically. They didn't give a damn. Like, as I said before, the rural communities remained largely pagan for what pagan could do. And the reason why this happened is that simply paganism didn't have any ideological chance to compete with Christianity. It wasn't even conceived in an oppositional sense. And why? Because they were rights. They were rights. They were not about having another faith that was opposed to Christianity. You could be a Christian and still making the very same exact pagan rites you had always done. Now, this required some little modification, because obviously, you couldn't worship another deity in this sense. But that's what the point. What is a deity in the first place? We have this, in fact, theistic prejudice that the pagans had real deities, like intended as personifications. It's not exactly like that. The pagan deities, especially in this more primitive contexts of Central Northern Europe, were actually considered more as entities of some kind that corresponded to certain, natural elements or feelings or experiences that we can't even define properly at this point in history, because we've gone so far from that. It's a pity, actually. But paganism in this sense is beautiful because it's full of this very strong shades that interpret the world, but at the same time they're not incompatible, for example, with an intellectual acknowledgement of the written world. Think about the difference that existed between the written world and the oral world at this point. The Christianity of the cities, of the elites, is a written world. It comes from the book. Paganism comes from orality, and this is already a characteristic, that difference that makes the two things being at very different levels. And Christianity simply said, okay, why is that we should make this enormous effort to convert all people who live out there? Because, by the way, the overwhelming majority of the people lived outside the cities, like in old pre-industrial times. For what at the end of the day? If they keep working, if they keep, trading, coming to the market, etc., yeah, we should say, okay, this is Christian land. Nobody should oppose that, but nobody did at the end of the day, because life was life for these people who lived in their agricultural cycles, in their relation with nature, didn't even know the city as such. The overwhelming majority of people lived in the countryside, as we've said, and that was their world. They weren't globetrotters. They lived there. They were rooted to their peaceful villages, and that they weren't even, we know that life in this context was absolutely not, very, very, very tender, very happy, very, let's say, edifying. But at the same time, it was a brutal world, messed up. We know it because just look at what modern peasant societies were practically about. The ones we start knowing something about fundamentally. Constant abuses, violence, oppression. It was disgusting in many ways. But they were on their own, in their own dimension. So they didn't actually care about Christianity in the first place. They didn't have anything pro, but they also didn't have anything against. Or maybe there was something they had pro or against every once in a while, but it wasn't such to cause this massive shift or creating this terrible conflict that people want to do. All the conflict that emerges from here emerges when there is a political clash, when you have a people that is traditionally pagan and there is another one that is traditionally Christian, and the Christian one is usually also the more developed because of the Roman legacy of certain geographical distribution and development, etc., begins to bully the other. and saying, oh, we do it in the name of God, but at the end of the day, it's not because of God, because even if religion had not been there, they would have done it anyway, because that's how literally every single community in history has ever behaved, and that's it. And the pagans were about their own religion too, even with the limits that we have said before. And it turns out actually that when there was not this conflict, think about the evangelization of Iceland. That was perfectly autonomous. It wasn't imposed. They decided that in 2 or 3 generations, Icelanders passed to be from being complete pagans to be Christians. How do you think it happened? There was no violence in there. It was the elites who decided, okay, let's do this in this. By the way, elites would think about Iceland in the 12th century, in what it really could be like. It was really. More like a very fairly egalitarian. That means very few stratified society because it was dramatically, primitive. Let's put it in this way. But they simply converted to Christianity by themselves. What was the context there? Where was the imposition? What was the war of conversion? There was nothing like that. And the simple answer why it's nothing like that is that these processes happened by themselves, largely, as it happened for the overwhelming majority of Northern Europe. Contrarily wise to what we believe, tribal societies, more primitive societies, have much less cultural resistance than stratified, developed societies. And that's where you meet more cultural resistance in ideologism, right? So these other peoples, already knew Christianity, and then they had partly embraced it like other beliefs, because that's also how what we call the polytheists reasons, like, that everything is viable at the end of the day. So there is nothing strange, for example, into Scandinavian society of, let's put, the 10th century, to accept the fact that you believed in Jesus Christ, for example, but you still made pagan rites. It was absolutely normal. It's documented by the northern sagas, and it's we can make parallelisms all over history, but this seemed to be the most triggering today, and everybody freaks out and gets hysterical about it. But we know that there are the same people from those times writing about it, and people who had no agenda in that sense. We were not the bishop, the guy who had to write for the sake of there were people describing this, and actually also being able that they show you that they weren't naive people who had no understanding of this stuff. They perfectly understood what the point was at the time. It's also the myth of the the intellectual superiority, in the sense, winning over the naivety of the good savage. No, it's not like that. Neither, because societies were, they were kind of different, but let's be honest. Also, there is not an enormous difference between even the Franks or the Anglo-Saxons or the Saxons or the Scandinavians. I mean, of course, France is way different. There are strong differences, massive differences sometimes, but they are relatively to the early Middle Ages, not really to, in general, this like I don't know, it's as if a 20th century country invaded a country from that is still at the Iron Age level. Like it's not like that, of course. So there's not even this disparity, this difference between the means of and you understand, in fact, that Christianity travels through the elites. That's how it really expands. It's not really something that even the same Christian elites care about being spread in the lower strata of the population, unless, but that's an exception that confirms the rule, there isn't some very serious political reason, that is, like in the case of the Franks, that they invaded Saxony. And at that point, Saxon resistance was cultural, was religious, was driven partially by that, but it was mostly caused by the fact that they had been conquered by a foreign power, and also one that they were not particularly, appreciative of, maybe also because of religion. Surely the pagan ethos depreciated Christianity by certain standards. But from what we know, well, this was evidently not really the case all the time. Actually, many in this pagan world accepted Christianity individually without any problem, and it's solidly documented. Especially also even for the far north, right? So you know what? Today I'm kind of ranting a lot, but the reason I do it, it's not because I am trying to convince you, because I don't think I'm here to convince you. I'm doing it because I feel that it's so much easier to understand history than what is commonly thought. I mean, the history that naturally we have come up with because that we know. So it's particularly important, in my opinion, to at least tell that those perspectives are here. Because take every average, go out there on any other YouTube channel or comment sections and find a video where people do not kill each other on essentially these were rapers and murderers because they were either theistic or atheistic, and it was all about religion. That's so ridiculous. And I'm not saying it. I mean, I'm not the one who came up with this idea. This is the normal level in the history of religion, in history in general, in anthropology. So why is that we have this massive gap between what academia believes on factual evidence, scientific evidence, and what the masses at this point need to believe? Because this is so polarized that you need it, and on a level that is wrong, that makes both sides wrong, that you understand that nobody even cares about the historical problem in the first place. It only cares about having the team to support. So, aside from this, it's trying to get a bit more from a territorial point of view. Coming back to the episcopal perspective, and I think it's interesting, and is that as we've seen, there is this great civil reorganization, or better, organization that is maintained by Christianity from the Roman times in lands where the empire has vanished. Well, this was grounded on the episcopal seats, as we've seen. So let's take an example, Italy. It's important because it's the most urbanized region in Europe. So you have these two halves, let's say, the center south and center north, let's say, depending on, and this gives you already an idea of the intersectionality of what a disgusting word is. The intersections, let's say, that existed between these two areas, right? And so in the center south, since early empire, they had this being very thick net of cities. There was given with they had this little territories that because there were many cities, right? And the space naturally was what it was. So this had multiplicated fundamentally the episcopal seats for every city. And as a consequence, this is interesting, this episcopal seats didn't have the possibility to extend their own influence much further from the city walls, because other cities were dramatically close. So and therefore the space to control was much smaller. This is what at the end of the day was. When you take centered northern Italy, for example, there were less cities in absolute terms, but this favored the development of wide ecclesiastical districts, districtuations. Also because the crisis between the 4th and the 6th century had caused also partly, a pretty sound demographic loss in part. Some of them, had migrated, others had died, and so on. So in certain areas, the formerly habitated areas were now deserted by people. So the episcopal settlement was one of the factors that the more favored the survival of the city, even within this different, for example, urbanistic but also socio-institutional setting. Where am I going with this? Well, I would like to make you reflect on one aspect of this, is that the example of Italy is important because it shows that one thing, because beyond these centuries, what happened, telling the truth, is that central northern Italy, also for other reasons, became much better organized from an episcopal point of view. There were way better forms of administration and of connection. While in central southern Italy, cities had maintained this kind of episcopates, but bishoprics, but they had also lacked this greater ability of connecting. Like, there were all small fragmented centers that fought partly against each other in a place that was also transformed into a frontier in many ways. Northern central Italy now had a kingdom proper, and therefore the crown also reordered a little bit these things. So paradoxically, what I'm saying here is that the episcopal centers of the north had the ability to look much more far in range as a consequence. And this is what happened in part also in other areas of Europe, where basically there were much fewer cities, but this entailed that basically every single bishopric came to dominate on much larger areas. And that's, for example, while in France or in Germany in post-Carolingian times, bishops would gain such a dramatic importance, even as territorial lords. It is very interesting, because, for example, in Italy, bishops were dramatically important as well for controlling the regions, because the region was full of cities in comparison to north of the Alps, but these bishops remained within the cities. Instead, north of the Alps, the bishops became to behave like real territorial lords. It's naturally also in Italy there was a process like this, but it was relatively, that had different bases. Maybe one day we will analyze better, but just for telling you how, especially after the collapse of the Carolingian Empire, this let's say this ecclesiastical administration was relatively sound in front of the collapse of central authority, of public authority, of secular authority, let's say that. And that's where, the church owes too much to our civilization, because at the end of the day, the connective tissue, the cultural connective tissue of post-Carolingian Europe are the monasteries, are the church, is the bishoprics, and they struggle pretty hard to maintain standing a world now that is basically devoid of a central public authority, but that lives within the church as a major player of um, let's say, of political equilibrium. Now, we don't have absolutely any time to explain the importance of the church in the later centuries, but for now we stick to the very early Middle Ages in this video, but you understand what the consequences are. I mean, up to the development of the great feudal monarchies of the low Middle Ages, objectively the church was not a lordship proper in comparison to the other territorial princes of lay origin, etc. But at least on average, or at least let's say that the lay aristocracy had always kind of a greater power than the ecclesiastical one, with notable exceptions, but it was like the case. But the church still managed to equilibrate the system. Think about the pieces of God, or the truces of God, even the reforming instances of the church, and this idea that that they partly stemmed from within the same church at the end of the day. Also in there we discussed it on Schwerpunkt. Reasons are complicated, but thinking about the same crusades, I mean, this idea of this concern of starting to conceive Christian society as a fundamentally united element. I mean, if the church had not been there, or it had not supported, for example, the Carolingian Empire by creating the empire de facto, ideologically, politically, institutionally, well, Europe would have remained all fragmented, like it was before the Carolingian times, like fragmented, especially at the cultural level, because naturally also in post-Carolingian times it was fragmented, but it was not fragmented in cultural ways. The educational system were drawn heavily from Rome, from Italy, from these areas that had remained sensibly more Romanized and literate and aware of the bigger potentials that institutions and the force of law, of administration, of a point of reference really was, and this brought a lot of light in the north. Rome was not so important for no reason, right? It wasn't just there. I really don't like when the church is believed to have been just a bunch of rich people who did weird things around it. This was a great work of progress, of improvement, of coordination. I mean, there were people in the early Middle Ages here traveling back and forth from Rome to the outskirts of Europe to work for coordinating these communities, organizing them, and being allied with the political authorities and maintaining a pacification. Yes, as we were saying before, you can't say, well, it also helped the progressive political centralization and consequent social certification of the story. Well, yes, and that wasn't really good, but at the end of the day, it's that from those institutions that were formed that also our states in like half of a millennium would start to originate, like the modern states, as we start thinking them, and this idea of order, of discipline, and that's important. It can't be seen, and the church has a lot to do with this. Has a lot to do. I hope to make a lot more of these videos. This one is relatively small. Let's say that I just wanted to address the existence in general of these problems, of the fact that there was a level that Christianity managed to expand both at the city level and at the country level, and that it's not to be given for granted, given how certain forms of cultural spread had existed up to a few time ago. So, and coordination is important. That's a key word I want to stress. Territorial and administrative organization of the church really owed a lot to the Roman Empire as well. And we're talking about all those forms of coordination that episcopal seats had, sometimes between, but also over the others. As we were saying at the beginning of the video, there is a hierarchy within the same church. The bishops of the dioceses, for example, that made that had as a point of reference in the great metropolis of the Roman world, the ones of Constantinople, Antioch, Alexandria, and in Rome, but also Ravenna, Aquileia, and Milan, etc., obtained in a short time this sort of natural supremacy over the bishops of the surrounding cities that tended, in fact, to overlap the preeminence of urban aristocracies of the major cities on the ones of the minor cities. So that's why they were called metropolitic dioceses at the end of the day. You see, this is important. Aside from, the Islamic invasions arrived at one point, so already Antioch, Alexandria, and Jerusalem are knocked out. But look at the geography of this. You have basically this Hellenistic world that whose capitals are Antioch, Jerusalem, and Alexandria. Constantinople is not really an Hellenistic capital. It's something that is born in the late Roman Empire proper, like a new city. So it's particular. It's become the center of another empire. It's mostly like a political and military authority, and Constantinople doesn't have quite of a religious background, right? But it has its own importance, and that's what we want here in this exactly. Because if you look at the rest of the cities, like Rome, Ravenna, Aquileia, and Milan, you see that these are all in Italy, for example. And you say, how were these the most important cities of the empire? By the way, during the 6th century, let's assume, Italy had some of the largest cities of the whole empire, even cities like Verona, like Pavia, they were big at the time. And at the time, they weren't larger than a few thousands, maybe tens of thousands of inhabitants, but they were still the largest thing existing out there. Think about how important this was, not just for the coordination of this bishoprics, but think about, these are the same cities from which also communal civilization develops. That's not to be forgotten. But what we're interested in the most in here is the hierarchies that get formed. The metropolitic seats have this greater and most obvious base in the cities as well, and these were the biggest cities there. Definitely Alexandria for Egypt, Jerusalem for Palestine, Antioch for Syria, Constantinople for the Bosphorus area that was dramatically important all around. It was also pretty urbanized, but also, Constantinople has this pretty evident strategic location. And Rome in Italy, right? So these were the big centers. There were others, as we've seen before. Toledo for Spain, for example, was also a very important center. Carthage for Africa, that is modern-day Tunisia, roughly. But these were cities that were structuring their own hierarchies, right? So that, as we said before, theoretically all bishops in Christianity had an equal say in spiritual affairs, and that's why ecumenic councils are in fact ecumenic, because bishops from literally the whole Christian world had to come to those councils and to emanate a decision that in this sense was superior to the one of any other bishop. In fact, a lot of criticism that was moved, we were talking about it in that video made recently on the medieval ideal of peace, that the various criticism that that existed towards the Church of Rome, especially increasing towards late Middle Ages, was due to this preeminence that had acquired in the monarchical fashion without a real base of legitimization. Like saying, Rome, where is it really written? Rome had a primacy of power, of honor. Sorry, as we know, I even made a video about that. If you're interested, you can look at. But at the same time, it was quite different from the beginnings. Right, Rome had acquired this big power. And how had it happened? Well, partly because it was a big city. I mean, to make it very banal, and that's part of the reason also why Saint Peter and Saint Paul had been martyrized in there, because that was the freaking capital of the Roman Empire. So the preeminence of cities is important, because the cities at this point represent what is closer to Roman legacy out there, culturally speaking, in terms of lifestyle. It's correct to consider early medieval Europe, especially a bit everywhere actually, but especially in this Latin Germanic world, as mostly about agriculture, right, rural communities, etc. But we often forget that there was a urban world that never quite died, especially in southern Europe, that gets definitely transformed, but not so excessively from Roman times. There's a continuity between certain cities and in the ancient, in the Roman Empire, and then into, say, from the ancient world into medieval times, right? Because the Byzantine Empire is technically still there, but the point I'm trying to make, I guess, I don't know if you're following me at this point, is that it's really about a hierarchy that is built on the base of cities, just like the Romans had built it. So what favors the survival of the church, its contacts, is really this ancient net that existed between the cities. And that's what's amazing of the early medieval church, that it talks a freaking lot. They communicate from everywhere, from Ireland to Syria, from Constantinople to Spain. I mean, they talk a lot. And actually the most important center, guess what it is? Rome. Why? Because it's in the very center of this whole story. It's between the Mediterranean and continental Europe. It's between East and West. It's between, a lot of, it communicates continuously with everyone. Rome is so central, geographically speaking, that throughout all the Middle Ages, and from a spiritual point of view, maintains this primate. And even in terms of cultural development, for half of the Middle Ages at least, it remains definitely the most active cultural and intellectual and theological center in Western Christianity. And this can't be forgotten. This can't be said, okay, well, we don't care because we were about something. No, because Rome's influence reached far and wide, everywhere. Not just later when the reform had happened, the Gregorian reform, but from the very beginning. Everybody knows the advantages that derive from being connected with the Rome. Excuse me, I drink a little bit. Religious advantages, but also political ones. I would say chiefly political ones. It's also, not a surprise that Charlemagne gets crowned in Rome. And from here we could tell a lot of other stories, but I fear that this video is too long by the way it is. We should... So, maybe we should add maybe one thing, is that the particular prestige attached, in fact, to connect to the Roman episcopal seat. We're not talking just for the role of the city, but because of that preeminence of honor that was de facto recognized to the bishop of Rome as successor of Peter Apostle, right? So this is also not just anecdotal, right? And this partly can be reconnected with what we were saying before about the concept of the empire, what Rome really represented, like the center of something more than just the empire of the church, but in fact of its own sum. Rome is really the eternal city. It remains always so. And many people will say, well, but this is theoretically ideal because the empire didn't exist anymore, and also the papacy at this point doesn't quite have a real territorial domination aside from Rome, but also within Rome there are many aristocrats and that have a lot to say with papal matters, but they're ultimately the same people who get elected popes. Yes, it's true, as it is true, for example, that this Roman primacy was strongly contrasted by the other patriarchal seats that only, but that I would say that this is the reason why you should think why Rome came to be at the end of the day what it become in terms of a papal monarchy and the sole spiritual guide and undisputed political guide of the West at the end of the story by the 11th century. And how do we explain this actually? Well, it was a long political and doctrinal process that lasted in fact up to the 11th century that led Rome to become this that brought, let's say better, the real supremacy of the papacy over all the Western churches. And there were ferocious rivalries, even between, take Rome and Ravenna for example. Ravenna was ferociously, aside from the fact that it was the capital of Byzantine Italy, and theoretically Rome had to be, but now the papacy had taken over Rome, while in Ravenna it was mostly the Byzantine Exarch. It was kind to do something about there, but that declines, for example. Why does that decline? Well, because also the empire has problems. There is also this aspect in Roman history in the early Middle Ages is never to be forgotten, is the very intense contacts with Constantinople proper. I mean, the idea that theoretically the city had to come back within the Byzantine Empire up to, this was concretely feasible up to let's say up to the 12th century in theory, at least in the sense that the empire could come to claim back southern Italy chiefly, and leaving Rome basically in the north. This role of say of buffer state or something that could, however, be reincorporated within the Byzantine sphere of influence. Then that fails, and the Byzantine Empire also crumbles after some time with the Fourth Crusade. But Rome never, the popes never ceased to look at the horizon, what's going on in Constantinople, because at the end of the day they know what the real deal is. Like, the Germanic emperors can keep believing what they want, but the popes know better, and probably they know better than anyone else, because at the end of the day they managed to remain independent, and that's not a small feat for a power that was actually relatively weak politically, militarily speaking. Not politically, but militarily in terms of territorial domination. The construction of the papal state, something that took a lot of time. But it was the political options that made this power sound, and that's also partly how the thing is explained. But it didn't happen in other centers, or at least that happened in other centers, but it failed, broadly speaking. Let's say that there is something about special about Rome in itself that we will have to maybe deepen in the future, because for now it sounds too difficult in at least to given the time that we have. So I hope that I haven't annoyed you terribly with all my rants and my say ideas about this phase in history, but let's say that it's a chapter that nobody considers, and I'm trying to do my best effort to bring it further. And aside from the things about the prejudices about religion and how we interpret history, well, those are important as well. I mean, I don't know whether you listen to this video or not, or how many people will eventually comment in the future. Maybe I will have necessary to shut down this stuff because of live threats, etc. But death threats. I mean, but I think at this point, what I try to do is to explain you why it's not the case. I mean, I don't. You know what? I was looking at tell you another story, because at this point, who cares? It's 10 minutes more. I was looking through certain videos some time ago. I don't remember when, and I watched a video that I could tell you simply what it was about, because I wasn't particularly interested into it, but it was about a certain topic that now I will partly criticize, so I don't want to tell you what it was, to be fair, and it's not important, but it was a particular context, let's say, in which and as you know, I don't listen to other videos actually, but I like to read the comments sometimes in order to make a bit of marketing policies, let's say, to see what people like or care about or think, because that's food for thought for me on Schwerpunkt. And this was a prominent channel, by the way, and that's what made it more interesting. One of the comments basically stated, referring to the creator, to who was making the video. This was about history in general, so it was telling a story from the past, and it was basically complimenting the creator for being honest about the biased perspective of the creator, which is pretty strange in the sense that okay, I understand the point. It was fair, actually, because there are lots of people out there who talk having hidden bias and not wanting to admit it, right? And we all have, by certain standards. Actually, the same guy who, here is stating, that obviously the bias had been explicitated, evidently, right? And I get the point. Like, it's better to have someone who openly says what the bias is about, to tell the history in a kind of a bent way to the needs of to that particular bias. But at the same time, the concept is, why would you listen to something that is bias? I mean, we have come to the point in which people prefer to listen something that they know it's actually wrong, or that at least accepted or appreciated even as a form of camaraderie or friendship. I don't know what it really was in that case. And I wonder, maybe is the future really heading towards that we listen to we watch stuff, we learn stuff by knowing that that thing backs our ideas, our preconceptions. The concept is, why should it be the case? I mean, why should it be interesting? I don't find any other answer but an emotional one. No, it's obvious that if before I make you all that story about the BS, and that exists in a kind of also emotional tone, like as you understand, my tone of emotion is pretty low during my videos, and for this reason it's also relatively boring, but I'm sure that over time, at least those who follow my videos regularly will actually understand that I'm really sincere about what I'm telling. Like, I can't tell you honest because I believe in things like, that we are kind of rigged morally by default, but it's sincerity. Like, all the time I criticize those prejudices, it's obviously because I have my own BS, because we all have, but at the end of the day, you have to understand also what the BS is really about. To me, I can tell you that I make these videos and I say these things simply because I think that this stuff is really correct besides what I think about it. That means practically not having, a real BS, in the sense, if you consider that BS is something you decide to have fundamentally, that you try to trick other people for. So the day I will go insane and say, okay, I will start making these videos because I have my own principles and I tell history according to my own sympathies, I will tell you. But you can be sure that I will not be doing it. I will rather stop making videos at that point, because I don't think otherwise what would be the sense. So I hope that you understood actually at this point that when I say those things, it's not to hurt anyone or to be a jerk or to be kind of provocative. Obviously, I like to provoke people who believe things that I for what I could check are wrong, or at least they're considered wrong, or there is no evidence to support them for supporting it. But that's, I think, the beauty of history, because if we start quarreling in the sense that we make videos just to aggress someone else, right? And that's not what I'm doing, really. It's just what I do to warn you, to bit of catch your own attention, maybe, and to present a side of the story that I try to make. To tell with punchlines, so that you can fixate them better in your mind and you can hopefully reflect on. Remember that I don't want to change anybody's ideas. I make these videos because I fundamentally believe that there is some good in the possibility of telling these stories and or other people listening to them, because I believe it can produce a deeper reflection on history, and I'm glad to see that at least someone cares, or at least someone understands, because I do receive some sort of little support at the end of the day, and I don't see much of a negative wave at the end of the day. So I don't know whether it's because I talk to people who are kind of more mature than me, so that they take me like as if, yeah, he's young, he's hot-headed, he says silly stuff, but at the end of the day, he's harmless, like what he says, and it's just interesting maybe to hear about these perspectives in general. Well, yeah, that's true, but I hope also that there is, I don't know, this is my dream at this point, a kind of the creation of a general consensus about certain historical topics on the basis of simply of what historiographical evidence proves, which is a few, as I tell you every time. Like that, what we know about history is dramatically few, but at least we know something about it, and we should make hypotheses all the time. You shouldn't stop to single thought that is dangerous, and it should never happen. But at least we should be able to acknowledge a hierarchy of authority and values, that work for us, not really because they are a way to impose our own opinion on other people, simply because it's something that at the end of the day you have to do if you want to learn something in the first place. Because what do you learn for if you don't have some intrinsic BS that sometimes, however, derives from our own biology? That is to say, we all have any intrinsic BS. It's like you have, I don't know, two candies in front of you, and you choose which one you eat first. You must have an intrinsic BS to choose one of them first over the other. That's how simple it gets. But the problem is when, I guess, when malice kicks in, and that's when things start to go seriously messed up, because it's not about the challenge of learning anymore. It's about being aggressive for no reason against other people. And I think I'm not aggressive against other people. Like, I understand that I risk it every time I speak, because we all do. We all risk to offend someone. But if we were not to speak in the first place, how could it be better, right? So I trust in the ability, and that's why yesterday I also made that video on communication, because that's what I believe in at the end of the day, and I don't see what's really wrong in accepting sometimes that things are more complicated than we think at all times. And it's not that there is a guy that arrives first and can say, haha, I'm top here, I'm better than you. Nobody gives a damn. I mean, it's just cool to get through it. And I think that the very cool thing about knowledge is that once that we are receptive towards it, is that it doesn't take maybe that much to break the mold, like to at the end of the day, to give food for thought to people in a way that they can use it autonomously to grow up, right? So okay, for now I just quit it here because it's become too long. I just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it, otherwise leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming contents. And for now, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.